You probably think the house is yours. Maybe your name is on the deed. Maybe you were the one paying the mortgage. Maybe it's been in your family for decades. But during a divorce, none of that guarantees you'll keep it. In fact, many people walk away from divorce stunned. Not because they lost the person, but because they lost the home they thought they'd never have to give up. What most people don't realize is that keeping the house after divorce has almost nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with timing, legal language, and decisions made when you're exhausted and emotionally drained. One signature, one overlooked section in your agreement, and suddenly the place you built your life in belongs to someone else. In this video, we're going to expose 7 overlooked factors that actually decide who keeps the house after a divorce. These aren't guesses. They're the hidden truths that lawyers and judges deal with every day. If you're going through a separation or even just preparing for what might come, this could be the difference between walking away with peace of mind or walking away with nothing. Let's get into it. One of the biggest misconceptions in divorce is thinking that whoever's name is on the deed automatically keeps the house. But that's not how the court sees it. The truth is, the name on the title means very little if the home is considered marital property. And in most cases, it is. Even if you bought the house before the marriage, once joint funds have been used to pay the mortgage, cover renovations, or maintain the property, that means even if you were the one who paid every bill, handled every repair, and handled every detail of the home, the court may still treat it as a shared asset. And when that happens, the decision isn't based on who earned it, it's based on what's considered equitable, which doesn't always mean equal, and definitely doesn't always mean fair. And here's where it gets tricky. If the house was inherited or gifted to one spouse, you might think it's protected. But if it was ever refinanced jointly, or if both spouses contributed financially in any way, even through something as small as utilities or property taxes, the lines begin to blur fast. Suddenly, what you thought was yours becomes part of a negotiation. The courts are looking at the full picture, the timeline of ownership, how the home was used, how it was maintained, and how much each spouse benefited from it. It doesn't matter if only one person's name is on the paperwork. What matters is whether the house was treated like part of the marriage. That's what catches people off guard. They assume legal ownership equals legal protection, but divorce court doesn't work like that. It's not just about who owns what, it's about who used what and when, and in many cases, the court decides the house belongs to both, even if only one name is on the deed. So if you're relying on your name being the deciding factor, think again, because that might be the first thing the court disregards. And what comes next is even more dangerous because it's not about who owns the house, it's about who owes for it. If you think owning the house is complicated, just wait until you look at the mortgage. This is where things get messy fast because your name on the loan matters even more than your name on the deed. A lot of people don't realize that during a divorce, even if the court awards the house to your ex, you might still be legally responsible for the mortgage. That means if they miss a payment, it's your credit that takes the hit. If they default, the lender comes after both of you, and if the house goes into foreclosure, your financial future goes with it, no matter where you're living. Here's the worst part. Divorce agreements don't override loan contracts. Your lender doesn't care what the court decided. They care whose name is on the paperwork. So unless your ex refinances the mortgage in their own name, which isn't always possible with one income, you're stuck. You could be completely moved out, living in a different city, trying to rebuild your life, and still get dragged down by a house you no longer live in and a debt you can't control. It gets even more dangerous when people try to co-own the house post-divorce. On paper, it sounds reasonable. One person stays, both stay on the loan, and eventually they'll sell or refinance. But in reality, those eventually situations can stretch out for years. You're financially tied to someone you're no longer married to, with no control over their spending, their payment habits, or how they maintain the home. And if they decide to stop paying out of spite or struggle financially, you're on the hook. Some people agree to stay on the loan just to keep things smooth for the kids. But smooth turns to shattered real quick when late payments start showing up on your credit report, tanking your score, and limiting your ability to rent, borrow, or buy in the future. And by then, it's too late. So before you agree to let them keep the house, ask yourself, are they actually taking over the loan? Or are you just handing over the keys and keeping the liability? Because in the eyes of the bank, you're still married to that mortgage, whether you like it or not. And if that sounds like enough of a trap, the next section proves that even staying in the house doesn't mean you'll get to keep it. People often assume that if they're the one staying in the house after a divorce, that means they've won. But staying doesn't always equal keeping. In fact, in many cases, the spouse who stays in the house is only doing so temporarily and under conditions that almost guarantee they'll have to give it up later. Courts will often allow one person, usually the custodial parent, to remain in the home for the sake of stability, especially if there are kids involved. But that decision rarely comes with long-term security. It's more like a pause, not a promise. Here's how it usually works. One spouse stays in the home while the other moves out, and the agreement states that the house will eventually be refinanced or sold. The problem is refinancing isn't always possible, especially on a single income. And when that deadline comes, 6 months, a year, sometimes 2, the person living in the house finds out they can't qualify for a new loan. They don't have the income, or their credit isn't strong enough, or the house is worth less than expected. And suddenly the court orders the house sold. It's a brutal cycle. You spend months, maybe years, continuing to care for a home you thought you were keeping, only to be forced to leave. And by then you've invested emotionally, financially, and mentally in staying. You may have renovated it, made it your safe space, held on to it because it reminded you of a better time, but none of that matters when the math doesn't work. If the person staying can't afford to refinance or buy out the other spouse's share, the court's hands are tied. The house goes up for sale. And whatever hope you had of holding on to it disappears. And the financial damage doesn't stop there. People often forget that during this temporary stay, they're still responsible for upkeep, taxes, insurance, and repairs. If something breaks, if property values drop, if market conditions change, you're absorbing all the risk. And if it does end in a forced sale, the costs of real estate commissions, closing fees, and debts can wipe out any profit you thought you were getting. The truth is, staying in a house gives the illusion of stability, but it's often just a delay of the inevitable. If you're the one staying, make sure you can actually afford to stay. Make sure refinancing is realistic. Make sure the timeline in the agreement doesn't trap you into a false sense of security. Because the house might feel like home, but if the numbers don't work, you're just borrowing time. And what happens in the next section is even more deceptive because it looks like a fair deal until it flips on you completely. Sometimes, in an effort to simplify things or avoid drawn-out court battles, one spouse agrees to let the other keep the house in exchange for something else. It's called a buyout. On paper, it sounds fair. One person keeps the house, and the other gets compensated through cash, retirement funds, or by walking away with a larger share of other assets. It feels like a clean trade. But what most people don't realize is that this kind of deal can backfire badly. Here's why. The value of a house isn't just the number you see on Zillow. It comes with costs, repairs, taxes, insurance, upkeep, and those aren't always factored into the buyout equation. Let's say the court values the house at $500,000, 0 cents, and your ex agrees to keep it while you walk away with a bigger piece of the retirement account. Sounds balanced, right? But then the roof needs replacing, the HVAC system fails, or the property taxes spike. Suddenly that $500,000 home is a financial sinkhole, and you've already signed away your right to any share of it. Even worse, real estate markets fluctuate. What seems like a solid asset today might drop in value tomorrow. You could give up liquid, dependable money in exchange for a house that ends up being worth far less or harder to sell when you need it most. And unlike cash or investments, you can't split a house if plans change. You're stuck with it, for better or worse. Then there's the emotional side. People get attached to homes. They think, if I can just keep the house, I'll be okay. But what they don't always see is that in order to keep it, they're giving up everything else: retirement security, emergency funds, long-term investments. They trade financial flexibility for bricks and sentiment. And that decision might feel good in the moment, but years later, when the house becomes too expensive or too big to manage alone, they realize the trade wasn't worth it. Buyouts also tend to assume that both sides are being completely transparent, but in divorce, that's not always the case. One spouse might agree to a higher house value to avoid paying cash, leaving the other with an overvalued, underperforming asset. And once the papers are signed, there's no undoing it. So before agreeing to keep the house, in exchange for giving up something else, take a hard look at the numbers, not just what the house is worth, but what it will cost to keep it livable, sellable, and financially sustainable. Because what looks like a smart trade today might end up being the very thing that drains you tomorrow. And just when you think it can get more complicated, the next section reveals how the court can take your decision out of your hands completely, especially when kids are involved. When kids are involved, the question of who keeps the house isn't just about money anymore. It becomes about stability, and that changes everything. Courts often lean toward keeping the custodial parent in the family home, especially if the children are still in school, have deep roots in the neighborhood, or rely on routines that make the house feel safe. On paper, this makes sense. Judges want to minimize disruption. They want to avoid adding more trauma to a child's life during a difficult time, but that well-meaning decision can completely shift the balance of power in a divorce and catch the other parent off guard. Imagine you paid the bulk of the mortgage, maybe you even bought the home before the marriage, but during the divorce, your spouse is awarded primary custody and suddenly they're the one staying in the house. Not because they invested more into it, but because the court believes it's best for the kids. And once that happens, it can be incredibly difficult to challenge. The emotional weight of protecting the children often overrides financial fairness. This also puts the non-custodial parent in a tight spot. You might be forced to continue contributing to the mortgage, either directly or indirectly, while living somewhere else, paying for your own rent or mortgage at the same time. You may have to wait months, even years, for the court to reevaluate the living situation. And by then, the legal and emotional narrative has already been built around the kids staying put. It gets even more complicated when the house was part of a buyout or shared agreement. Courts may delay selling the house until the children reach a certain age, sometimes 18. That means one parent is effectively stuck in the house, responsible for everything, while the other has no access to the asset or the equity they're technically entitled to. And if the person living there doesn't maintain the home or keep up with payments, I think it still affects both parties, especially if the mortgage is joint. The emotional side of this is just as tough. If you're the parent who loses both custody and the house, it can feel like your entire foundation is being stripped away. The place where you once tucked your kids into bed now belongs to someone else. And even if you win shared custody later, the house, the routines, the roots remain tied to the parent who stayed. So before you assume logic or fairness will guide who gets the house, understand this. When kids are involved, the court's priority isn't balance, it's stability. And that means the house often goes to whoever keeps the children, even if that decision leaves the other person out in the cold. And if you're not legally married, the next section shows how you might lose the house without even stepping foot in court. Most people assume that property disputes only get complicated during a legal divorce. But for unmarried couples who separate after sharing a home, the situation can be even worse and far more unforgiving. When you're not legally married, there's no divorce court to step in, no built-in process to divide assets, and no automatic protections. That means the house and everything tied to it fall strictly under property law, not family law. And in that world, the person whose name is on the deed usually wins, period. It doesn't matter how much you contributed. You could have paid every mortgage bill, handled every repair, poured years of savings into remodeling that home. But if your name isn't on the title, you have no legal claim, you can't force a sale, you can't demand equity, you can't even guarantee you'll be allowed to stay. Because legally, it was never yours. This hits hard for people who enter the relationship with good intentions, assuming shared living meant shared ownership. Maybe they trusted their partner, maybe they never thought things would end. But when that relationship breaks down, they realize they've built their life and tied their finances to something that offers them no security at all. And by then, it's too late to add your name to the deed. The person who holds the title holds the power. Even in cases where both names are on the deed, if there's no agreement about what happens during a breakup, it can become a nightmare. One person might want to sell, the other might refuse. One might stop paying the mortgage out of spite, leaving the other to carry the full burden or risk foreclosure. And without a legal framework to resolve the dispute, you're left navigating a property battle with no roadmap and no guaranteed outcome. Some couples try to settle it privately, buyouts, agreements, handshake deals, but without legal documentation, those arrangements can fall apart instantly. And if the relationship was financially imbalanced, with one partner relying on the other's income or credit, the fallout can be devastating. The one left out of the deed is often left out of the future. If you're not married and living together, this should be a wake-up call. Get it in writing, clarify who owns what, have a cohabitation agreement. Because once love turns into loss, the law isn't there to protect what felt fair. It only enforces what's written down. And for those who assume selling the house will solve everything, the next section reveals why walking away doesn't always mean walking away with anything at all. For some couples, all the fighting, all the confusion, all the dragging court dates lead to one conclusion: just sell the house. It sounds like the cleanest option. Split the proceeds, walk away, start fresh. But here's what most people don't realize until it's too late. Selling the house doesn't always mean profit. In fact, by the time everything is said and done, you might walk away with next to nothing. First, there's the timing. Divorces rarely happen when the housing market is perfect. If you're forced to sell in a downturn or under pressure to close quickly, you'll likely take a hit on the price. And that's before the real costs even start. Realtor fees, closing costs, repairs, staging, all of it eats into your share. Then there are outstanding debts. Maybe there's a second mortgage, maybe the house was refinanced a few years ago and there's barely any equity left. Or maybe your ex ran up a lien you didn't even know about. By the time the sale goes through and the bills are paid, the number you thought you were splitting has already disappeared. And here's the emotional cost no one tells you about. Selling the house sounds easy until you have to box up years of memories. The kids' old rooms, the photo wall, the spot on the kitchen counter where you used to drink coffee every morning. You walk through each room, not just packing items, but reliving moments. It's not just property, it's your past. And when the sale closes, you don't just lose a structure, you lose a piece of yourself. Then there's the legal nightmare of selling with someone you're no longer getting along with. Every decision, what price to list at, which offer to accept, who pays for what becomes a negotiation. And when emotions are high, deals fall apart fast. You could spend months locked in conflict, all while the house sits on the market and drains more money. So while selling might seem like a neutral solution, the reality is often more complicated, more painful, and far less profitable than you think. And by the end, many people wonder if it was even worth it. They gave up the home, the memories, and most of the money, all to walk away with peace they still haven't found. If you're considering selling, make sure you're doing it with eyes wide open. Because once the house is gone, there's no going back. And sometimes the clean break you hope for turns out to be the cut that hurt the most. Now, with everything on the table, let's bring it all together and talk about what this really means for your future. By now, you've probably realized that keeping the house after divorce isn't just about who paid the mortgage or whose name is on the deed. It's about timing, strategy, legal language, and decisions made when your world feels like it's falling apart. For so many people, the house becomes the hill they're willing to die on. Not because it's a smart financial move, but because it feels like the last piece of stability in a life that's unraveling. But here's the truth no one wants to admit. Sometimes the house isn't worth what it costs you. Not in dollars, in stress, in regret, in years lost trying to hold on to something that no longer fits the life you're building. Keeping the house might mean sacrificing your retirement. Selling it might mean losing a piece of yourself. Walking away might feel like failure, but in the end, the real question isn't who gets the house. It's what kind of life do you want after this is over? Because your future won't be built on square footage or hardwood floors. It'll be built on peace of mind, on choices that support your freedom, not your fear, on knowing that you protected your long-term well-being even when it hurt. So before you fight for the house or walk away from it, stop and ask yourself, is this a decision made out of fear, out of guilt, out of habit, or is it truly what's best for you going forward? Because at the end of the day, the house is just a structure. Your future is the home you actually have to live in.